Can't you just unload around me? So this happened earlier today and was too perfect to not share with you guys. I work in construction as the foreman for a new house build. The location is kinda strange. The house is 250 feet up a hill via a footpath only. All of our materials have to come up this footpath by hand. It's a pain in the ass to manually carry, quite literally, an entire house up this hill. One of our saving graces is having the 2 parking spots on the street at the bottom of this hill marked with official no parking signs. Unfortunately, there is an elementary school about half a block away, and the parents of children seem to regularly, at least twice a day, think it's okay to park in our spots. Now I consider myself a reasonable person, so if someone is parked in the spots and we don't have a delivery or a need to park a truck, I will let it go. If we need the spots and there's someone parked there, however, I will ask them to move nicely, and most of the time they do so immediately. Until today. I get a phone call from the lumber delivery truck that is en route to our location. He says he'll be there in about 2 or 3 minutes. I let him know I will meet him at the street and make sure he has space to park. He's carrying all of the material to frame the roof of our house, which is a lot of really big lumber and will take easily an hour to bring up the hill, so naturally, I didn't want him parked in the middle of the street with his hazards on for an hour, when we have a perfectly good parking spot for him. As I begin my trip down the hill, I notice there is a school parent sitting in her car idling, assuming she's just waiting to pick up her child. I walk up to her car and politely let her know that she is parked in a no parking zone, and we really need her to clear it to park a delivery truck. She scoffs at me and rudely states back, "I'll just be a few minutes, and your truck isn't here. Take a chill pill, dude." Before I can respond, a giant lumber truck comes around the corner, and I wave to him, and then gesture towards him to the woman in the car, who has now put her window back up to ignore me. I put on my best customer service smile and wave at her. Through the window, she put it down halfway and angrily shouts, "What?" By now, the truck has pulled up alongside her car, and I politely ask her again, with a stronger tone of voice, to move her vehicle, reminding her that she is illegally parked in a tow-away zone. Then she gives me this wonderful idea. She says, "Can't you guys just unload around me? Jesus, it's not that hard." I give her another smile and walk away, a brilliant plan forming in my head. I instruct the delivery driver to park as closely to her as possible and block her in with the porta potty that is at one end of our reserved spots, and the parked car that is parked just adjacent to our spots on the other end. He smiles because he immediately gets what I'm trying to do and proceeds to expertly block this lady and her car into a little 2 parking spot jail. We unstrap the lumber, and my guys begin humping material up the hill. Meanwhile, I call the police parking enforcement to let them know the situation. At this point in time, I wasn't trying to get her in trouble. I just wanted a record of why we were blocking part of the street so we don't get in trouble with the city. The very friendly traffic officer lets me know that she can be there in about 30 minutes and deal with the situation for me. Wonderful. As we continue to unload lumber, the child of the parent shows up, and wouldn't you know it? Mom is just now realizing that the lumber truck is parked so close she can't get out of her driver door to meet her kid. She awkwardly clambers across the inside of her car and stumbles out the passenger door, shooting glaring looks at me and the truck driver in the process. She loads her kid into the back and then begins to realize that she has no way of leaving. She comes storming up to myself and the driver and states, "I'm in a big hurry. You need to move your damn truck right now so I can go." Before I can respond, the driver gets a grin on his face and says, "Ma'am, in order to unload the lumber on the truck, we had to unstrap it. And per our company policy, I'm not allowed to move the truck with any unsecured load on it. Sorry." This sends her into near aneurysm levels of blood pressure. Meanwhile, I can barely contain my laughter. "Fuck your policy, I have somewhere to be," she barks back at him. At this point, with impeccably convenient timing, the parking enforcement officer shows up and parks behind the truck. She doesn't see the officer arrive, and while the officer is still getting out of her vehicle, I just casually say, "Can't you just pull out around it? It's not that hard." With the biggest shit-eating grin I've ever had, I watch as she realizes that I just used her line on her. "Fuck you!" she yells, and storms back to her car and angrily clambers back, in through the passenger door and into the driver's seat. At this point, the officer is walking up to myself and the driver before she can even introduce herself. The mom in the car slams it into reverse and stomps on the gas, crashing into our porta potty and knocking it over, and then throws the car into drive and tries to mount the curb and drive on the sidewalk. The officer, driver, and I are staring in disbelief as she gets halfway over the curb and gets stuck. I can hear her screaming obscenities over the idling truck from inside her car. The officer promptly walks up to the door of the car and orders her out. My favorite part of the entire thing is watching her face go to shock as she realized she just did all of that in front of a police officer. She gets slapped in cuffs as the parking officer calls for a second unit, and she is promptly sat on the very curb she tried to drive over. She sits on the curb yelling to the now two officers about how we told her she could stay there and that we never asked her to move. The traffic officer responds that she was the one who was originally called when she first refused to move, and that she already knows what's going on. While myself and the driver are giving a report to the second officer, my guys finish moving the remainder of the lumber and the driver finishes his statement and takes off to go back to the yard. By the end of the ordeal, she was arrested, charged with child endangerment. Her kid was in the back of the car the whole time. Reckless driving, destruction of property, the porta potty, and driving on a suspended license. On top of all that, she also got her car towed. The kid went home with his grandma and she went to spend some quality time in a cell. I never expected her to actually heed my advice to just pull out around it. But I think next time she'll probably think twice about parking in a tow-away zone if she ever gets a license again.
Next story.
My grandmother put greedy preachers in their places. Twice. Even after she died. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was a member of a large evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the USA. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights, and was very active in supporting home missions as well as helping with other youth programs. She always tithed and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to Big White Church functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of Big White Church youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that, on a Big White Church youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials that one of the assistant pastors, whom I'll call Ass Pastor, had forgotten and asked her to get in time for our morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, I'll call him Pompous Pastor, never found out that Ass Pastor had screwed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. Ass Pastor never even thanked Grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said that she didn't mind at all. She told me her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73 when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, Pompous Pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service, which she and Grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Pompous Pastor was too busy, but Ass Pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting. With my grandma literally on her deathbed, Grandma, Grandpa, and Ass Pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then Ass Pastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then Pastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. Pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21, Luke 12:34, etc. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, weep with those who weep. But nobody, not Grandpa, not her daughter, my mom, nor any of my uncles or Grandma's siblings, ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, former Marine sergeant and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed Pastor and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away, and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Pompous Pastor and Pastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from Big White Church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited Pompous Pastor and Pastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing this, although you all know me, and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife. Tell a story about her that is worth remembering, or anything else that you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today. I have asked several family members to prepare statements, but you don't have to have anything prepared. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so." There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours, and, as best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging. 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few remarked that funerals are better without preachers anyway, or something similar. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because, she told my mom, that makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50-plus years and had worked hard and lived modestly, but it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there is no legal requirement for anyone to attend the reading of the will or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near-universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct. But the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit, extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family. But we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, etc., so that if you attended several of these, you would see just about every one of your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even great-aunts and uncles who were grandmas and grandpas, siblings and in-laws. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa that Grandma's will contained some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see pompous pastor and ass pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins, and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that pompous pastor and ass pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these two preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed to more than overflowing room before the entire meeting was over, because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after all of the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant, amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was first beneficiary listed in the will. But, after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s, then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece, and nephew received a little more, then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to Big White Church, pompous pastor, and ass pastor were almost the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the Big White Church and preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to Big White Church, pompous pastor and ass pastor, Ms. Blank Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me, come to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members, who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly, and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me for many, many years, but when I needed you in your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit. When I was dying, and I invited pompous pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church. Maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they loved to hear pompous pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But pompous pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. Ass pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. Pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20%, of my entire estate for what was now my former church, Big White Church. This amount was blank. Here they named the amount, an enormous shitload of money, generating muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor. So, I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to Big White Church to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely and no longer able to work my ass off for them for free, like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to Ass Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Pompous Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud. But we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished. Yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a charity called, which he named and I'll call Black Charity. Then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we could tell that Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread, and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra." Large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal. Every eye in the room was now fixated on Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of Grandma's and Grandpa's sons, let the silence continue a few seconds more. If we had been able to read Pompous Pastor's and Ass Pastor's minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from Big White Church. They ran a free food and clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, Big White Church, which was, and still is, 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to Black Charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because Black Charity was practicing the social gospel, while Big White Church was preaching the true gospel. Big White Church even sued to try to get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled, and very little money actually changed hands. But this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why Big White Church, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity, and they would say, those N-words were getting uppity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time. But they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everyone, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, Pompous Pastor, and Ass Pastor had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry, and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings, whom you hate, disrespect, and have mistreated, are better people than you are. So they deserve my money more than you do." Having allowed time for everyone to observe Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity, and how they and their church had treated our grandma. The lawyer said, "The amount is..." Then he named the exact same amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will.
That's all the stories for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share with your friends. I'm a bit shy and prefer to stay behind the scenes, so I create these faceless Reddit story videos to bring you the best stories without stepping in front of the camera. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.